So again, my name is Josephine and I'm from ISA. And thank you for attending today's presentation, From Fiction to Reality, Using Simulations for Teaching Peace and Conflict Resolution. Our speaker today is Daniela Irrera, Professor of International Relations at the School of Advanced Defense Studies in Rome. Her simulation model, Game of Peace, has been awarded in 2020 for the best European teaching practices that enhance learning for international students, the IMPACT project. In today's presentation, Daniela will discuss the use of simulations as an active learning tool and is based on Game of Peace, a negotiation model designed for encompassing students of international relations in taking on the role of actors involved in a civil war, including an international mediator that intervenes for bringing peace and stability. So Daniela will end the presentation with a short simulation demonstrating the Game of Peace potentialities and benefits. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to our speaker today. And here's Danielle.
Thank you very much, Josephine. Thank you. And I would like, first of all, to thank Josephine and Sarah Dor and everyone who allowed me to have this invitation to this webinar. And I'm delighted to have the chance to discuss about my simulation, one of my simulations, Game of Peace, which I will briefly introduce in a second. And I look forward to interacting with you all and getting feedbacks on that. But I would also emphasize the fact that I have learned everything from people part of the alias committee within ISA. So when I started several years ago, I knew nothing, no knowledge at all about simulations, and I gradually learned from distinguished scholars and professors how to join simulation, first of all. So I joined simulations also during ISA conferences as a member, and then I started to make experiments with my students, and I gradually developed my own models. And now what I will introduce to you, the Game of Peace model, is the final result of years and years of attempts made with my students. And I'm also grateful to my students who have tested, when they have tested the model, and they have also offered to me several feedbacks. I prepared a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen. I hope it is visible clearly to everyone. I prepared this presentation as I was for the first half of the webinar, so like about 30 minutes, let's say, and then I look forward to your comments and questions or anything which can be you want to share. Also, please feel free to type in the chat if you, in the meantime. You may find to see this small logo that I have made by myself. Obviously, is not nothing special. It's something that I could be able to prepare to let's say represent what Game of Peace is for me. I mean, a negotiation model and a way to engage students in working together and develop also soft skills and negotiation skills. So this is what I would like to discuss with you. So very, very briefly, benefits and pedagogical impact of active learning tools like this one. Obviously, I won't spend too much time on this because probably among you, I also see people who have lots of experience in this. Also, I saw in the audience Victor Azal that I also quoted in my publications about simulations. And then I will go to the second part, which is a Game of Peace experience. So how I developed and the different steps and experiments that I have done with this simulation. And the last part will be the last session I have played with my students last year. Students, they are MA students of the course in international relations and global civil society, so mainly based on security, but obviously this can be applied to any BA course as well, based on international relations or international studies. So I was telling you why I was so interested and impressed by simulations, and I discovered that it was a teaching tool. So I've always played in the past active learning tools like working groups or I don't know, splitting students in groups and asking them to prepare a position document or a position paper. But then simulation is something absolutely different. So what I really like of simulations is the fact that, and also students like, is they can they study, first of all, paradigms, theories, concepts, even very difficult ones or very difficult contested concepts, and then they apply to the reality. And so the secondly is also very important and useful for students to experiment, so to try to work together on decision-making processes, also negotiations, because in a second I will tell you about the peace conference that is part of a game of peace. And also it is a practical training because many students, I teach, now I'm based in I changed my institution. I'm based in Rome, and this is I mainly teach to postgraduate students, not only military, but also many civilians who are trained to be to work in the field of security and defense, for example. And they have never at universities have never experienced practical stuff or practical exercises. Also in Catania, where I was teaching until last year, I used to have very, very multicultural classes of students, and many of them coming from different universities, they never experienced practical things. So this is also relevant for making students understand that learning is also a practical thing, and this is not something that we can take for granted. And then obviously increase the levels of study, because students have been forced to study issues like the war in Syria or the war in Yemen. They didn't even know where Yemen was located before, so they have to go back to the books and read everything, and this is part of the simulation as well. Now, again, I will tell you in a second. So this is also a way to push students to study in a different way, something that will never ever study, or they will find boring. So this is why I really like the simulation as a teaching tool, and I'm sure that my experience is shared by many of you and by many instructors and professors and teachers all around the world. And again, these are something that, again, I have learned from prominent scholars in the Alias committee. I mean, how to practically organize simulations, so we can replicate a fiction situation or even non-fiction, so we can play with real conflicts, for example, or non-real conflicts, a fiction. That Game of Peace obviously comes from Game of Thrones. So I used to use non-real scenarios, but then students asked me to play with real conflicts, and then I started to do that. So obviously 2 participants, but obviously we have like small groups or even big, large groups that obviously will require more people, so more effort, so individuals and teams. So they obviously this requires lots of work for us playing simulations, because we need to prepare scenarios, we need to drive students' attention and students' focus on some specific things, and also prepare rules for these activities and be sure that these activities rules are actually respected. So the pedagogical impact of simulations are obviously very high, and particularly in in the case of very, very multicultural groups of students. So this is Game of Peace when I played in the year when I also was awarded. I mean, my simulation was awarded, and this has been prepared by my students. So you see that their faces, and you see that they are from different backgrounds. So the Italians, but also many people from Northern African countries. There were also Erasmus students from European countries. So many people, differences with differences in their political views, religious views, different approaches to life. And it was difficult to keep them together in the same classroom sometimes because of, teaching international relations may require discussion on very, very sensitive topics, and sometimes divergences and differences may arise, and discussions can be quite conflictual in the classroom. So this simulation is also a way to make them working together and trying to understand how things can be negotiated, let's say. So what is Game of Peace? Again, the result of years of work in the classroom. So basically, it's a conflict resolution simulation. So I usually use a real conflict. So it may be obviously Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria, more recently Yemen. So this year I would like to play the war in Mali. So a real conflict. And those are different actors that are involved. So obviously the real actors, but there are also external actors. So most of the times we have the US involved, or we have the European countries involved, or we may have Turkey or Russia, depending on the conflict, and also non-state actors. So for example, we had ISIS, or we had the Kurdish movements, or we may also have NGOs, depending on the things that I would like to stress, or sometimes media. Obviously, the more actors, the more non-state actors are involved in the simulation, the more difficult it will be to manage the scenario. So what people have to do is to work on, they are negotiators, and they have, all actors are representing themselves, real actors, and they have to identify a sort of an agreement, which may be even simply a ceasefire in some cases, like in the last year, the one I will describe very soon was the war in Ukraine, sorry. And in the end, what all people were able to achieve was the signing a ceasefire and a promise to convene again for another peace conference and find a way to negotiate, obviously. And then this means that there is also an external mediator. So there's a student or a group of students who play the role of mediator. Usually the United Nations, the Secretary General, or a diplomat sent by the UN, or the European Union High Commissioner for Defense and Security Policy, or another diplomat sent by the EU, or someone who can actually exist in the reality. So basically, all these conflicts are because this is as part of the our theoretical discussion on theories of new wars and old wars, theories on civil conflicts and the shifting changes in security environment, changes in diplomacy, in conflict resolution tools and mechanisms. So it is basically a simulation based on the application of the concepts and theories they have previously studied. And so this concept is quite contested with power sharing. So they have to, in the end, understand whether a civil conflict can be managed by using some diplomatic creativity or some power sharing commitment. So objectives may be different. So most of the times to have a ceasefire, which means stop conflict, stop the violence, or stop using military activities, promote more dialogue among all parts, also manage side problems, which may be, depending on the conflict, human rights violations or decommissioning or masses of refugees, anti-terrorism measures, and so on. So in the end, what they have to achieve, because obviously we are playing, but it should also be something that can exist in the reality. A political solution which can be satisfying everyone. Obviously, it's impossible to bring peace. I mean, they cannot bring peace out of the blue in Syria or Ukraine, but they can find, they at least they have to identify those agreements or those documents or those final outcome which can give some satisfaction to all involved parts. So that's the point of developing negotiation skills and also soft skills that they usually don't develop while they are just sitting in the classroom and listen to even very interesting classes, but the soft skills can be more developed by using these games. So just a sample of how I used the game of peace during these years. So now, I mean, from this year on, I will teach in Rome, but for 15 years, I have taught in Catania, University of Catania in the south of Italy. So giving courses of international relations, international politics, and to the BA students, and then global civil society to the MA course. And I also teach a course on political violence and terrorism in Bishkek, in Kyrgyzstan, at the OCE Academy to MA students. So you see the different kinds of conflicts I have chosen. So recently also, especially in Bishkek, I discussed about terrorism in Afghanistan, or jihadism and radicalization in Central Asia. And so the number of participants may vary. Obviously, when it comes to BA, there are more students, which is more challenging, especially because they are younger. They are more likely to play, but they are also more likely to make confusions because they focus more on fun rather than studying. But even fun is an important part of a game of peace. So basically, this is what I do, just to give an idea of what how I split. And it very much depends on the length of the course, so the numbers of hours, numbers of credits at disposal. It is part of the assessment. So I usually allocate 20 hours. My course was 54 hours in total, and I allocated 20 hours or 25 sometimes hours to the simulation. And because in the past I used to play very short simulation, and students were complaining that it was too short and they needed more time. So now I have longer simulation of 25 hours a lot, but still it is not enough because they always complained and time is not enough. And I include this in the assessment. So I look at what they do and how they perform in their groups, and also the documents they prepare and how they prepare such documents. And this is part of the assessment. So 1 week prior the simulation, I provide the political scenario and the list of groups and roles, so people already know in advance which role they will play and in which group they will be located, and they also know already the scenario and the instructions, so they have to study the conflict. So for example, they have to play the role, the conflict in Mali. They don't know anything about this conflict, so they have to study the conflict to analyze the scenario. They have to get acquainted with the role that have been assigned to them. I'm always very cautious, especially if I have like Muslim students or when I depending on the conflict, or last year, for example, I had Russian and Ukrainians in the same classroom, I try to to respect their potential sensitiveness to some questions. So that the roles are assigned with several criteria. That's a lot of work, but in the end, it's useful. It is worth doing that. And then during the week prior to the simulation, again, I also provide a list of readings and websites. Usually also websites from the last more recent blog posts or newspapers that can also provide instant information about the conflict. So students have always to study this, and also have to start preparing what they will do. I mean, if they are, for example, they are playing the role of Ukraine in the conflict, or playing the role of US, or playing the role of the European Union, the mediator, they have to start thinking of what they would like to do. So obviously they are already in groups and they start working in groups. I try to make them working while they are in the classroom, but then in the end they make WhatsApp groups, they meet in online now on Teams or other breakout rooms. So they find a way to keep in touch, and they like it because it's a way for them to keep in touch and to have more fun. And then the first phase, there are interactions. So they start interacting. So groups may interact in an informal way, so they may have informal contacts. The mediator, so I usually prepare different rooms, and the mediator may move around to all groups and can try to collect information. So actors, usually political actors, but also non-state groups, they start to have contacts with others, and they prepare their potentially policy plans. So they may have sometimes secret contacts, they may have official contacts. It's also up to them to organize this space as they want. And they always be there in the rooms and I look at what they are doing. So also interesting is that I played the same simulation during COVID, so in online, and I was, so people were working in different breakout rooms, and I used to move around and look at what they were doing, and it worked very well. Although face-to-face simulation is always much better. And then the second phase is a peace conference. So you think that the first phase may also last like 2 weeks. Okay, I have classes of 2 hours, 3 days per week. And then we have the last 2 weeks where students have to prepare a peace conference. So it's a formal conference. So when the sample now, it will be probably easier to understand. So that the mediator convene a peace conference and ask groups to participate if they are willing to participate. Because, for example, Russia may be not willing to participate, or other actors may be not willing to participate, and they have to prepare a political statement just for starting the discussion. And usually the mediator chair the discussion and try to facilitate a common final document. And we usually spend, let's say, 1.5 weeks, so 6 sessions during which they meet, and still is always they would like to always have more time because it's not enough. And at the end, I was taught by again prominent scholars in the Alias committee. The briefing is always necessary. So the briefing is very, very important and useful for them, for students, but also for me. So it is absolutely necessary. I usually do at the end, so the very end. So they stop playing the simulation. So they have achieved a result, any result, and they immediately have to say and share with others what they have experienced. So there are lots of benefits. So, for example, this is what I've collected from them, because I also have an anonymous questionnaire which is sent sometime after the simulation. So I have immediate feedbacks and more, let's say, short-term feedbacks. So that among benefits of people liked having more interactions with others, because otherwise interactions were not so strong, and then also their negotiation skills, so they were forced to discuss and to negotiate. And this also created a peaceful environment, especially when, again, with multicultural class, where there are very different views on the things we discuss. This can create a community. Obviously, many of them found difficult to play a specific role, like to play the role of ISIS, to play the role of Taliban, for example, to consider someone else's interests. And also they wanted to they say that the preparation needed should be strong, and they would love to study more, have more time for studying, and obviously more time for playing the simulation. So this is the last simulation I have played this year, so the war in Ukraine. So again, we were in Europe. The topic is extremely sensitive, and particularly in Italy. And again, in my class, which is very multicultural, I had a student from Ukraine who came to Catania following a special call for protecting students and facilitating students in need. And we also had two Russian students, as it was not easy to some extent to play the role. Well, these are just names that can bring to nobody in particular, but then just to give an idea of the kind of groups I have prepared, because I have not so many students. So usually the mediator is made of 1 or 2 or 3 people. And then obviously we had Ukraine and Russia, and I decided to facilitate, to involve just US and Turkey, not to involve too many political actors, because the situation was already too sensitive in the classroom. And this is what I asked them to do. So to facilitate a ceasefire, to identify a potential settlement for the country, obviously all very difficult things, to manage the commissioning, also considering the level of armament in the country, to manage particularly the IDP issues, because we discuss a lot about the presence of internally displaced people in many conflict zones, which is let's say a problem that is not so much stressed in our courses. So we discuss a lot, and so I include it in the simulation, and then to convene in the end a ceasefire, a peace conference. Sorry. And so this is what I gave to them in terms of let's say instructions. So for 3 days, they have to identify their own characters, so absolutely up to them to identify who they were. So they have to look at real names and real position statements, real use of words, and so on. And then obviously identify the values and goals and the policy plans. So I mean, the real ones, obviously they they could not play the role of a very, very peaceful Russia, for example. So realistic positions, but also to manage and to sum up their policy plan, and then also to build their collective actor profile, so that the group was also sharing these particular views. And so this was the first step. And then the second step, so the peace conference convened in Geneva by the EU, so it's a neutral place for 2 days, which means, I mean, when I say 3 days here, we have like 5 hours per day. So it was a very intense session. Obviously, I asked them to be available, and they were available. So they prefer to condense the simulation in few days, and 2 days is again 10 hours in total. And this is what I asked them to negotiators to do this, so they can do again. These are all things that I have again learned by the simulations that I have played during ISA conference. So it's nice that I also brought this experience, which was very, very useful to me, into the simulations I'm playing with my own students. And then also the use of military force as a measure of last resort, because I don't know if you have the same idea, same impression that recently students, IR students, are more likely to study war instead of peace. So they like to study how military interventions are shaped. And so their temptation is always to use a more military approach. So obviously I have to try to not to stop, because I don't stop students' ideas, but to make them understand that this conference was this simulation is mainly based on negotiation rather than the use of violence. And again, it was not easy. Be fair, be very, very respectful, because many students sometimes like to be aggressive, and it's a way to because they like the idea that they have power. So they are the US, they have power. So they are the Taliban, they are powerful. And be creative. I mean, develop a diplomatic plan which can be creative, but can actually be also realistic. And also, I'm using the slides that I have used with them. They also have to use a diplomatic and formal language. So it was also nice that many students went to Googled and how to write a diplomatic document, how to address people, a head of state in a diplomatic way, and so they learned how to write some documents. And when they in the end produced documents, they were very well written and according to a very, very diplomatic style. And again, I was around to look at what they were doing, and also to be sure that nothing serious happened. But in the end, nothing serious happened. So it was just a way to share the kind of simulations I play. And so the last sample I have played this year, and yeah, I leave it here. I stopped in sharing my screen, and I look forward to your comments or anything you want to share with me. Thank you.
Hi. So I just wanted to see if anybody has any questions. This would be a good time for, you can write a question in the chat or in the Q&A session. Or if you could raise your hand if we can unmute you if you have a question as well. And there is a comment, so I'm just going to read the comment. There's a comment here that said, thank you. This comment was from Catherine Rosie, and it says, thank you for the fascinating webinar. I teach history at the Royal Military College of Canada and would like to try one of these simulations with my students. I'm wondering if it would please be possible to share resources such as your PowerPoint or any other documents you may have to facilitate the planning. And if that would be okay with you. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, also part of the award, for example, was the building up of a repository. So there is, I'm happy to share a link with there's a web page where I have described in a more detailed way all the different phases of the simulation, but I'm also happy to share more documents. So if Catherine, do you want to email me? I will be very happy to keep in touch.
Okay, next question is from Timothy Hazen. Timothy says, how do you incorporate the simulation into the grading assignments for the class?
So the course is the assessment is made in percentages, and so there are different activities like attendance, a presentation based on individual students, presentation based on an article. And so the 40% of the final assessment is made by the simulation performance. So what they do during the simulation, I look at what they say, how they fulfill their tasks, and also especially during the final conference. So it's a lot, because 40% the final assessment is a lot, but I discovered that students agree on this. Because they prefer, there is also a final paper, but I agree, they agree because they put more commitment into the simulation, because they want to have a better assessment.
Thank you. And then so Victor did type his question, and he said,
Oh.
first, will you send the simulation after the presentation? The second question was to Daniela, have there ever been any occasions where things went wrong? And if so, how do you address them?
Yeah, so Victor, thank you very much. Nice that you are there, although I cannot hear you. Well, yes, of course, I will share my presentation. Absolutely, this is made for this webinar. Yes, actually, I had in some cases, always people started to quarrel because of different ideas, but I think the most difficult simulation I had was 2 years ago with the Afghanistan case, the Afghan case, because there was a student, a very nice student, but with a very, very realist approach. I mean, he liked offensive realism to problem. So he really liked the idea of solving issues by using the military force, because he thought that it was exactly the way things should be done, and there was no way to convince him, because I mean the course was based on civil society and non-state actors, but he was absolutely not agreeing with anything, and he asked me absolutely to play the role of Taliban. I didn't want it, obviously, because I already knew the potential outcome. But at the same time, I didn't want to force him to do something else. So he decided he wanted to play the role of Taliban. And then it was extremely difficult. He didn't want to negotiate. He was obviously the head of Taliban. He didn't want to negotiate. He didn't accept to participate even on a parallel session of the peace conference. So in the end, after lots of sessions, several sessions, I allowed a sort of parallel conference. So there were two conferences. And also the Taliban produced a document, and the mediator accepted to read the document by the Taliban. And in the end, it was the only way to stop threatening coming from the Taliban. But it was very difficult. I mean, it was the first time I didn't know how to manage, because he didn't want to. He didn't want to give up on anything.
And just as a follow-up to that question, Victor said, also, have you or are you planning to use this in the Middle East tied to Israel and the Palestinians?
Well, I would love to, but frankly speaking, this is the case study where I was involved since the very beginning. And I learned so much from Hemda Ben Yehuda and other people. So, for example, I joined another simulation with my own students. So it was online. So my own students participated to an online simulation, which was not obviously Game of Peace. So I didn't use the Middle Eastern case so far, but now I think that so the simulation is consolidated enough, I believe, at least for the kind of students I have, that probably I will also play. It will be very challenging for me in terms of scenarios and preparation, but I think I will do.
Another question from Erin Roland Carlin, and she asks, when you have students from particular countries, do you allow them to represent their own country of origin or assign them a different one?
No, I usually assign a different one. because for two reasons. So the first one is that obviously is necessary to avoid extreme nationalism, because I mean it is not good for the simulation to have this fanaticism or extremism, and at the same time students have to identify with a specific character which should be a different one, because there is no sense to play the role of their own country. And also is, I believe, is also from a pedagogical point of view, and that's the second point. I think it's much better for a student to try to put himself or herself in someone else's shoes and to learn something different. So I have always do this way. I always done this way.
Okay, another question from Althea Maria Rivas, and she asks, I wonder if you consider the ethics of using real case studies and whether that has caused any issues in your classes.
Yeah. Of course, sometimes I'm always very cautious. So this is why in the past I used non-real conflicts, because it was much easier. But it was a request from students to play with real conflicts because they wanted to experience real things. So I never, except the case of Taliban, for example, I never experienced big difficulties, even in this last case, playing with Ukrainian war, for example. So even Russian and the Ukrainian girls, because they were ladies, they were smart enough, because I talked to them. So I wanted to be sure in advance that there was no problem for them, because otherwise I would have chosen a different conflict. But they are sure that it was a good way for them to look at the problem from a different perspective. So obviously, pedagogical studies are not my main field. So I try to do things by using common sense, and obviously if there are problems or if I envisage potential problems, I try to avoid things in advance.
Great. Next question is from Priya, and Priya, you're raising your hand, so I'm going to allow you to you can talk your question. Go ahead.
Yes. Yes,
Yep.
can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can hear you.
Yes. Thank you so much. It was really very good talk. No, I have two questions. One question is like we have a society where there is some kind of like violence which is inbuilt in the system, or you can say structure or culture itself. And the other issue is like the ongoing process which is there in Afghanistan that you have discussed about that. In that transition phase, so how can we deal with this kind of methods in this kind of situation where conflict is very much prevalent in the structure or culture itself? Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Priya. If I correctly understood your question, how I face the fact that violence is a structural part of a specific society. For answering this question, let me say also that I have the chance and the privilege to play simulations with my students, obviously, in European context, but also in a non-European context, which was completely different experience for me. So, for example, I was visiting professor in India. So in that case, for example, we played another kind of Game of Peace was based on a different conflict, so they asked me to play the conflict in Kashmir, and obviously everything came out because they although they play different roles and try to be, as I gave instructions, try to be diplomatic as much as possible and try to avoid violence and so on. Again, nationalistic approach and nationalistic tensions were very, very high. So it was not easy to manage, but at the same time, they in the end they realized that they were playing, that there was a simulation made for developing their soft skills, and in the end it was successful. So some kind of tensions during the simulation, but then in the end things were very, very good. And also, as I said before, I also teach in Bishkek, and also the young generations in Central Asia are unfortunately young, very talented students who are living in non-democratic and troubled societies. So all these countries, I also have students from Afghanistan again. They usually are online, and of course, and so sad to know women are no more allowed to come to Bishkek for joining the course. Even online, they cannot. Or a guy from Mongolia, there were people from Mongolia. So students from all these countries are populated by very, very young and talented students. And it's difficult for them when we play a simulation to try to figure out what a peace settlement could be, because I never experienced. Some of them have never experienced peace in their life. Some of them have never experienced a normal life because of their countries. So it is very difficult, because it is a sort of things existing in their mind. So it's very difficult for me in those cases, because again, I'm not equipped to understand the psychology of the whole issue. But I always try, in those cases, not to go too much deeper into the question, because otherwise I can open a Pandora box and I won't be able to manage. But it is true that in many cases, there's kind of structural violence in the society, which very easily comes out when we have these kind of games. And it's not just being seated in a classroom and listening to someone speaking. When they have to work together, this may happen.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. So a question from Antonio Salazar. He says, hello, great discussion. I teach international relations in the Philippines. An aspect about simulations that I have always been fascinated is how do you, as the teacher and facilitator, saw yourself in terms of how the simulation is being done? Do you see yourself more as an observer or an active participant in the simulation?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Well, it depends. In the past, I used to be just an observer, and it was mainly done for let's say for the assessment. But then I became more and more an active participant. I mean, never influencing the game, or never influencing students' performance, but active in the sense that I monitor them and try to avoid or to stop potential conflicts or potential struggles. And they also requested, many students also several times requested me they wanted to know more, they wanted to ask a question, they wanted to have some support, or in some moments of frustrations, because it can be very frustrating during negotiations which were not so successful. Some students were very, very frustrated and very upset, and they wanted to be supported, and I did. So I'm more and more active, and also I'm starting to learn more and more from students. So I feel active also from this point of view, because I'm learning from them. As I was a member of simulations during several ISA conferences, and I experienced by myself what being a negotiator means. Yeah, active, very active, I would say.
A question in the chat from Patricia Borelli. She says, "Thank you, Daniela. And I've been working with Model UN in Brazil, and it would be very interesting to simulate peace negotiations with my students. Please, can you share with us where you usually search for study materials to share with participants, and what kind of materials do you use for this preparation?"
Yeah, I know. Thank you, Patricia. I know the model UN very well, but it's a different thing, also much more professional. I always think that this is just a handmade model. A game of peace is very, very handmade. Model UN is the UN model is very, very, very professional. Of course, I would be very happy to share more materials, and also, for example, I can share because I prepare like a kind of fact sheets for the conflict students have to play, and I circulate in advance. So I try to make a very, very simple fact sheets with a list of with a map, because I discovered that a map is always necessary, so people can see where the country is located, and also the neighbors, so the regional level of involvement, and also a list of websites and list of readings, obviously things like blog posts, short articles, things that can help them to understand better the problem. And then obviously if they want to write a final paper on this, obviously they can ask me, and I will provide a more higher literature, more scientific literature. But when I prepare these for this preparation, I use a very, very like instant things that can help students to understand what is happening on field.
Okay, another question from Elizabeth. And did you notice any barriers to engagement while the students were working on the simulation? If so, how do you get students to re-engage with their role and the team?
Yeah, of course. It is part of my syllabus. And so students know in advance that there will be a simulation, and I always present and introduce a simulation during when I introduce a course. And of course, I anticipate only the conflict, so that I won't anticipate the roles and the materials and the instructions, just the conflict. So, and obviously it's part of the assessment, but I always say that if there is any kind of issue students have, they don't want to get involved in a simulation. That it never happened, frankly speaking, but I always say that if there is any problem, any issue, it's not a question for them, because they can avoid the simulation and they will prepare a longer final paper, or they will have another assignment. So if there is something they don't want to do, they won't do it. They want to do because they don't like interactions, or because they don't like specific aspect of the simulation, they are free not to participate. But it's a different thing when there are some specific issues which are not barriers to simulation. Like, for example, again, as I told you, Ukrainian and Russian students, or in the past, I also had a Palestinian student. And I played Syria. So if I talk to these people in advance privately, and I try to see if there is any specific issue they want to tell me in advance. But all students have always participated, and also they already know, because there are Facebook pages where they share pictures, videos, they have fun, and so students of next year will already know what kind of simulation they will play.
Great. And then another question from Toyin. How do you simulate peace and conflict resolution in a school in which most of the participants have never witnessed any political conflict?
Yeah, it is true. It will be much easier probably in Rome, where I will have students who have been, for example, peacekeepers or even civilian working in the peacekeeping operations, and they already have some expertise. These are young students, so BA students and MA students are very, very young. So they never experienced obviously a conflict, and good for them. except, for example, when I teach in Bishkek. And in those cases, unfortunately, students have always already been involved in a conflict for different reasons. But Europeans, let's say, or Italians, or people in Europe, they can hardly they have hardly experienced a conflict. So I try to stimulate their interest and their curiosities. Obviously, it does not happen at the same level with everyone. Someone is simply a little bit indifferent, but I try to push them to identify a little bit with the problem.
Okay. And then another question. How many conflict issues do the students negotiate in the peace conference in general, and how do they determine these issues?
It's just one conflict per simulation, obviously, just one. But I always include all related issues. So, for example, like counterterrorism, decommissioning, refugees, ethnic cleansing, depending on the conflict. So many problems in parallel that exist for real. And how I determine, obviously it's impossible for them to manage everything. So I leave it to them, and it's part of the critical assessment. So they have to identify, according to them and according to the actor they represent, which issue is more important. So, for example, in the last peace conference in Geneva, we're discussing, in Geneva, obviously, is a fictitious place. We were discussing the conflict in Ukraine. So the Ukrainian team was stressing more the IDP's problem and also the reconstruction of the country, while, for example, the mediator, the EU mediator, was also pushing on some more forms of decommissioning. So I leave to them, because it's also part of the study. I mean, what is the main, they make a list of priorities in the issues they have to manage. So it's part of their critical work.
And we have Victor.
How do I sound?
Yes, we can hear you.
Have you ever thought of using a violence game or simulation about violence beforehand, before you start the peace negotiation game, to give them a sense of where they're trying to get away from? Because I think that could be very useful. Even a game like Diplomacy, or I have a war game called Dalig and Vadan. I think that could be very. I really, really like the game that you're talking about. I would like to try and use it in the future, but I think that might be useful.
Yeah. Thank you, Victor. Yes, indeed. I've never tried. So far, I must confess, I never tried, but I've always studied a little bit what you said also in the war gaming, and then, for example, here in Rome, I found that there is an entire department war gaming, which is obviously used by military, but is also used by many civilians, and with involvement of several actors. And so the use of violence, and so the different examples involving violence before a peace conference and before a ceasefire may also be a different way of looking at things and looking at conflicts. But at the same time, I thought, and maybe I may be wrong, I don't know, but I thought that students were not equipped enough for making such experiments. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, so in my class, I teach a class in political violence where the ending simulation or the ending exercise is a peace negotiations, but I do games and exercises like Diplomacy, like Dalig and Vadan, other exercises. They get a real sense, well, not a real sense, but some sense of what political violence is like. And I think, and conflict, and I think that that could really help your students get I would give it a try. And I'd be happy to talk to you or anybody else about those games or exercises as well.
Yeah, thank you. But I think I will give a try as well. So I'll see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And then I had a comment from Priya and said, thanks a lot, Daniela. It's a really important lecture for the scholar of Peace and Conflict Resolution. I teach as an assistant professor in Center for Gondolin Thought and Peace Studies, and I wish to have you mail it for further communication in the regard. So I did add Daniela's email address into the chat for anybody who would like to, contact her and afterwards. And it looks like I have one more question for you. If you're okay with one more, we could do another question, Daniela.
Of course.
Yeah, okay. It says, I see scholars publishing about simulations. What do you think is the scholarly value of simulations? Does it contribute to any existing theoretical debate? And I am interested on the rationale for this interesting strand of political science scholarship.
Oh yeah, definitely. I strongly support research in simulations and active learning tools as well. So I've recently started to write also some publications on this. Frankly speaking, I never thought about active learning tools as a potential research topic, but then I discovered that we always need to have literature on this, because we also need, if instructors or teachers, professors want to prepare simulations or other forms of games, so they have to know how the better way to make them, to shape them. It's not just a textbook or a manual or something practical. There is also the need to understand a bit in a better way the pedagogical impact, and also to share the different models, because also different models can be applied to different context. I mean, we are talking so far, we have discussed about conflict resolution, IR, but then obviously we may talk about simulations in the EU politics or UN politics courses on to study institutional dynamics. So there are different contexts in which we can use simulations. So a literature and more research on this is necessary. And there are also empirical research now, because there are so many students involved, and surveys made by students. I also make my own surveys, and I collect this data to see if I can also write some meaningful publication. But I think it will expand more.
Great. So I think that's all the questions. And just to recap again, I did put Daniela's email in the chat. I'll do that one more time for anybody who is interested in that. And also, you will get an email for this presentation once the recording is available. But I also put in the chat a link for our YouTube channel, where you can always see all of our virtual events afterwards. But thank you again, Daniela. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation, very informative. We really appreciate your time, and it was a lot of great information. So thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me, and also thanks for these fantastic questions and comments that I have received. It's fantastic to have the chance to interact so much on a topic which is important for all of us, because we are all teaching in the end. Thanks.